In clinical psychiatry, an altered state of consciousness is strictly defined as a measurable deviation in subjective experience and psychological functioning from general waking norms. For early researchers, capturing that deviation presented an immediate paradox. The scientific method relies on objective external data, yet subjects returning from these states universally report the exact same characteristic. The experience is entirely ineffable. Without the means to quantify the unquantifiable, these states were historically abandoned to philosophy, religion, and the counterculture. They were considered impenetrable to clinical testing. Pioneering figures like William James recognized the distinct psychological validity of these subjective states, but they lacked the empirical tools to measure them. To bridge that gap, investigators realized they first had to stop taking our baseline state of mind for granted. They had to evaluate the exact biological utility of normal waking consciousness. If a waking state is merely one evolutionary adaptation, then a mystical or altered state is not a malfunction of the brain. It is an alternative mode of processing environmental data. This mechanical view of consciousness was theorized independently by the philosopher Henri Bergson, and later by Aldous Huxley, following his supervised experiments with mescaline. They proposed a radical inversion of how we think about the brain, arguing that the nervous system is primarily an eliminative organ rather than a productive one. They hypothesized a state called mind at large, a theoretical condition where an individual perceives the totality of cosmic and environmental data occurring everywhere all at once. But perceiving everything is entirely useless for biological survival. So the brain evolved to function as a reducing valve, funneling out the overwhelming majority of cosmic data, leaving only the narrow trickle of information required to keep an animal alive. Under this framework, an altered state happens when that filter is temporarily bypassed. Researchers identified several specific triggers capable of disabling this valve. These include pharmacological agents like psychedelics, instances of severe physiological trauma, and environments of extreme sensory overload. If an altered state is the mechanical result of removing a specific biological filter, then the subsequent flood of sensory data should produce experiences with consistent, predictable, and measurable structures across all human subjects. By the early 1960s, academic institutions finally began attempting to apply rigorous empirical measurements to this hypothesis of consciousness expansion. At Harvard University, psychologists initiated the psilocybin project, seeking to map the parameters of these experiences in a safe, controlled environment. The research gap was distinct. They needed quantifiable proof that ingesting a specific chemical substance induced a psychological state identical to the spontaneous experiences described by classical mystics. To test this, Walter Pahnke designed a double-blind controlled dissertation study utilizing psilocybin. Pahnke's core innovation was creating a psychometric tool to finally quantify the unquantifiable. He developed a standardized 9-category typology of mysticism. He broke down historical accounts of spiritual ecstasy into gradable phenomenological markers. These included internal unity, the transcendence of time and space, and paradoxicality. He even incorporated the concept of alleged ineffability. By treating the subject's documented inability to describe their state as a specific category, Pahnke turned the absence of language into a measurable data point. This 9-panel grid provided the first viable bridge between thousands of years of subjective spiritual accounts and hard, quantifiable clinical data. Pahnke administered 30 milligrams of psilocybin to experimental subjects under highly controlled settings, alongside a placebo control group. The data showed that the experimental group experienced psychological phenomena virtually indistinguishable from classical mystics. When scored against his typology, the psilocybin subjects generated statistically significant higher scores in 8 out of the 9 categories. The true utility of Pahnke's grid is that its application extends far beyond pharmacology. In a subsequent study, researcher John Panaccio applied Pahnke's exact same 9 categories to patients who had survived near-death experiences. The resulting clinical reports mapped perfectly onto the psychedelic data. Survivors of physiological trauma consistently reported the exact same loss of ego boundaries and transcendence of three-dimensional space. Furthermore, both the chemical ingestion group and the biological trauma group reported identical positive, persisting changes in attitude and behavior toward themselves and others, fulfilling the 9th and final category of Pahnke's typology. When a chemical compound and a biological brush with death produce the exact same statistically measurable psychological state, the resulting experience is proven to be a highly structured neurocognitive reality rather than a random hallucination. Pahnke's work successfully quantified what the structure of an altered state looks like. The remaining scientific hurdle was to uncover how the brain mechanically executed this shift on a systemic level. Julian Silverman developed a framework to answer this by analyzing altered states through the strict lens of perceptual and cognitive studies. Instead of analyzing the narrative content of mystical visions, Silverman focused entirely on the raw underlying attention styles utilized by the human nervous system. He noted that altered states are frequently preceded by periods of extreme sensory overload or extreme sensory underload, either of which severely destabilizes normal perception. This intense sensory disruption triggers immediate changes in neurophysiological response systems, physically altering body chemistry and overriding the standard biological filter. Demystifying the mystical experience requires looking strictly at these mechanical rules, specifically how the human nervous system physically regulates attention and processing of incoming environmental data. This table, published in Silverman's study, details the specific attentional response characteristics that differentiate an ordinary waking state from an altered state of consciousness. Looking at variable 1, stimulus intensity control, we see that normal waking consciousness relies on a baseline of mid-range sensitivity. In an altered state, the brain abandons this middle ground, shifting into either extreme hypersensitivity or a pronounced reduction in pain and stimulus tolerance. Moving down to variable 2, scanning control, the ordinary waking brain utilizes a balanced scanning to detect immediate threats. An altered state breaks this routine, triggering either minimal scanning or a hyper-erratic, high saccadic eye movement rate. The final, crucial variable is field articulation control. The ordinary waking state is defined by active, analytical, and segmentalizing perceptual responsiveness. It breaks the world down into distinct, separate parts. In an altered state, the brain shifts into a passive, global relational responsiveness. The subject literally perceives their environment as a single, interconnected whole, rather than a collection of separate objects. This physiological shift in visual and cognitive processing is the direct biological mechanism that produces the internal unity and self-transcendence universally reported by mystics and near-death survivors. Early clinical research proved that altered states of consciousness are not psychological aberrations. They are deeply embedded, mathematically predictable modes of human perception, demonstrating that our baseline reality is simply one of many possible configurations of the mind.